Night after night, we have to retell the evil things we did when we were alive.
I've loved horror from a very young age. My favourite film as a child being Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. And if that sounds like a kind of weird film for a child to love, yes, it was. The trademark Abbott and Costello patter and Lou's pristine physical comedy, taking the edge off these monsters that absolutely did scare me as a child, although that seems quite laughable looking back. I enjoyed being scared, and as I grew, this developed into a love of horror movies wherever I could find them. I became really into hammer horror, somehow deemed acceptable by my parents for a young boy with a yearning for the macabre. The thinking likely being that the older the film, the less likely I was to be damaged forever by its content. But everything changed when a recording of a late-night showing of Amicus Studios' 1972 film Asylum flickered to life on the old CRT in front of me. I simply didn't realise you could do this. It was like all these other classic horror movies, but with almost none of the boring talky bits. And if your attention started to wander, boom, there's a new story, a new setup, a new cast of characters. And hey, it's Peter Cushing again, I love him. And here's Christopher Lee, Dracula himself, and oh my god, it's Tom Baker. This deal is sealed, I'm here for the duration, bring me my juice box. These films blew my tiny stupid child brain. These were stories which rarely had a hero or heroine, and where the lead character would often find themselves either dead or in an inescapable pickle come the story's conclusion. Tales where the sole purpose was terror. I wasn't just in love with horror films, I was in love with the horror anthology, the horror portmanteau. And this video, or series of videos, is a love letter to that form, as well as an excuse for me to watch every single one I can get my hands on. Now, before I go on, I should mention that several of these stories contain recognisably racist tropes, which you may well argue are of their time, although there is at least one that very much isn't. I'm going to discuss these instances as they arrive and talk about why they are problematic, so be forewarned that these will be coming up in this video. So, I think I've waffled on like a food blogger before a recipe for quite long enough. You want to know how to make perfect roast potatoes just like my grandma, and I'm here to tell you how much salt. Let's talk about the history of the horror anthology. The origins of the horror anthology are literary, and most agree that the earliest example is Twice Told Tales, a collection of previously published short stories from the pen of Salem's own Nathaniel Hawthorne, the first volume of which was released in 1837. This was closely followed in 1839 by Edgar Allan Poe's Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, a title as clunky as it is inexplicable, which sold poorly at the time despite featuring the seminal Poe work, The Fall of the House of Usher, and quirky little delights like the Duke de la Omelette about a card game with the devil. The format largely emerged from the growth of periodicals in the 18th century, supplementing printed news that had become prevalent the century prior with essays, letters, poetry, and short stories, to meet the demands of a middle class that had become more affluent. With the growth of literacy among the working class in the 1800s, literacy in the United States reaching 80% and in the UK 97% by the end of the century, these periodicals became ever more diverse, and short horror stories along with gothic literature and penny dreadfuls were targeted at these emerging audiences. These were stories shorn of the need for what we would now call a traditional narrative structure due to their brevity, nary a sight of the Joseph Campbell hero's journey among them. They were instead, in essence, fables, straight from the oral tradition of horror storytelling, tales that warned of the dire consequences of behaving immorally, or failing to heed accepted wisdom. And indeed, some feel the first horror anthology was the fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm, replete as they were with murder, cruelty, and gruesome comeuppances. Many of these periodicals saw contributions in the form of short stories from some of the more distinguished or influential writers of the day. Not just Hawthorne and Poe, but as time went on, also the likes of Stoker, Conan Doyle, and Lovecraft. And the first cinematic horror anthology was the 1919 German silent movie Unheimlich Geschichten, or Eerie Tales starring Conrad Veidt, most famous today for his role in The Man Who Laughs being the visual inspiration for the character of the Joker in Batman. Directed by the prolific Richard Oswald and co-written by Oswald along with the equally prolific Robert Liebman, based on stories by Poe, Robert Louis Stevenson, and Anselm Hein, with one original story apiece from the co-writers. The film also marks the first occurrence of what will be an increasingly common feature of these films, the wraparound story, a technique almost as old as storytelling itself with its roots in Egyptian and Greek literature, but here more likely indebted to the use of the device by travelling theatrical troupes, enabling them to play out different stories in one showing with the same cast. In Eerie Tales, 3 ghastly ghouls come to life in a bookshop, stepping out of posters and overpowering the shop owner, before entertaining each other by acting out these tales of terror. So, is this any good? Well, I'm far from the greatest connoisseur of silent cinema, and these stories are quite slight, with the apparition based on Selma Hayek's Die Einschüchterung in particular just plain confusing, and the production is very basic and stagey. But Veidt has one of the great expressive faces in silent cinema and elevates every scene he's in. It is, at a minimum, an important artifact, but maybe not much more. Oswald remade the film as a talkie in 1932, excising the weaker stories and adding another Poe tale based on the system of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather. And although it's a lot of fun and superior to the original, it is structurally not an anthology, as the stories form a single, albeit rather fragmented, narrative. Next up, we have Fritz Lang's 1921 film Der Müde Tod, ein deutsches Volkslied in 6 Versen, known in English as Destiny, which is much easier to say, which centers around a young woman attempting to strike a deal with death to save her mysteriously departed loved one. Co-written by Lang's wife, Tia von Harbu, also the writer behind Lang's masterworks Metropolis and M. This is obviously a far more artistically ambitious endeavour than the cheap thrills of Eerie Tales, as Lang wrestles with the question of which is more powerful, love or death, and whether these two contradictory forces can coexist. Although received poorly on release, there was recognition for its groundbreaking for the time special effects, and its depiction of death as a character has been noted by many critics, including The Guardian's Peter Bradshaw in a 5-star review of the film from 2017, as being a direct influence on Bergman's depiction of death in The Seventh Seal. There was a word Bradshaw used in that review which I think sums it up, praising the film for its sophistication. And this is indeed incredibly sophisticated and ambitious cinema for 1921. It's a cliché to say of a beautiful film, every frame a painting, so much so that one of the most popular and best YouTube channels on film goes by that name. But my word, is it true here. From the long stairway that climbs towards death's domain to the candles that represent the remaining time of the living, this is a film rich in imagery and striking composition. If there are criticisms, well, one could be that it is no more a horror movie than the Bergman film it inspired. A criticism only in the context of this being a video about horror anthologies. It is instead a meditation on its themes of love, loss, and how they intersect. That loss is only felt if love is there in the first place, and hey, maybe we'll all end up in the same place eventually anyway. There are also depictions of other cultures that are, to put it kindly, of their time, an exotification that has not aged well. It also totally has boobs in it, which I didn't know was allowed, although so did Metropolis, so clearly it was. 1924 saw the release of another German anthology, Das Waxfiguren Cabinet, or Waxworks, directed by Paul Laney, who would go on to direct the original The Cat and the Canary, as well as Conrad Veidt in The Man Who Laughs. And although some sources say it was co-directed by Leo Berinsky, he was, as best as I can fathom, actually the producer and second unit director. It stars William Dieterle, who would go on himself to become a director of some renown, best known today for the Charles Norton starring Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1939, who, in the framing narrative, is hired to write backstories for a trio of waxworks. Harun al-Rashid, Ivan the Terrible, and Jack the Ripper, who already have pretty good backstories, actually. The main relevance of this film today is largely as an example of expressionist cinema, as it is a melange of imagery, with sets that are absurd and abstract and compositions that are impossible. A striking and stylish, cartoonish at times visual feast, although it narratively pales beside Robert Weiner's The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, a film to which it clearly owes a great debt. While this is certainly more recognisably horror than its forebears, the historical segments suffer from poor pacing, and a certain lack of chills, as well as some more unfortunate exoticism. And the Jack the Ripper segment, or Spring-Heeled Jack as he is called here, which will please all Oblivion fans, barely amounts to anything at all. A glimmer of frightful promise that ends before it's even begun. Still, we get to see Conrad Veidt again mugging gleefully as Ivan the Terrible, and that's never going to be a bad thing. As a piece of trivia, in 2013, Mike Patton from Mr. Bungle and Faith No More, accompanied by percussionists, performed a live soundtrack to the film. You can find it here on YouTube, and it's probably the way you should watch Waxworks if you're going to, as it is delightfully weird. It brings out the delightful weirdness of the film, and while they do stop before the Jack the Ripper segment, not before it builds from a potpourri of percussion into some very charming music indeed. The horror anthology then seemingly vanished, and if I'm missing something here, be sure to let me know in the comments, but when it did return, it was with arguably the definitive example of the form. In 1945, Ealing Studios, who came to be best known for a string of well-received comedies like The Lady Killers, Passport to Pimlico, and Kind Hearts and Coronets, found themselves emerging from the Second World War without much of an identity, perhaps exemplified by this odd duck of a film. We've already established that this isn't the first horror anthology, but it is the foundation of what the genre came to be, which shows how bold and original it was for its time. Watching this film now, it starts incredibly slowly, and it's possible a modern viewer may be put off by the cut-glass RP accents and howdy-ya-doos.
Mr. Granger.
How'd you do?
And this is Sally O'Hara. How'd you do?
And indeed, many of the tales spun are quite slight. The first two, a crash survivor receiving a haunting premonition,
Just room for one inside, sir.
and a game of sardines in an old country estate that turns ghostly, clocking in at around 5 and 7 minutes respectively. All of the stories do become longer and more elaborate as the film goes on, climaxing with the exquisite psychological horror of Hugo the ventriloquist dummy, the segment the film is arguably best known for, and for good reason. It is phenomenal. They are primarily anecdotes, both structurally and narratively, where later examples of horror anthologies tend to place these segments at the forefront of their narratives. You're here for the tales, not the crypt keeper. Dead of Night's wraparound story is the beating heart of the film. The mystery of whether or not the kindly architect Mr. Craig has indeed experienced all of these events previously in a dream, and whether it will all end as his premonition foretold, is what the film pivots on. The anthology segment's essentially dressing, before it all comes together in a wild and surreal finale. The film very much defying the expectations of anyone going in who thought it may be too quaint. Its tone veers wildly, its central mystery being presented as a rather relaxed chit-chat between main characters chain-smoking endlessly. Early stories being fairly light and breezy ghostly fare, before the haunted mirror segment adds a hefty dose of macabre melodrama, which in turn tumbles into the comedic and light golfer's story, based on a tale by H.G. Wells, starring Norton Wayne and Basil Radford, who you may recognise as the cricket-obsessed Charters and Caldecott from Hitchcock's The Lady Vanishes, although you may be unaware, as I was, that they parlayed their chemistry in that film into a recurring double act across 11 feature films, including this one, as well as several radio specials for the BBC. The film isn't simply a fun ghostly romp either, it is full of social commentary that reflects the era that produced it, as pointed out by Sam Osborne writing in the Social Review. The spectre of wartime trauma is discernible in the first two stories that comprise Dead of Night. The guilt of survivors is elicited by Hugh Granger's tale of being haunted by a sinister hearse driver who tells him, "There's room for one more, sir." The adolescent Sally O'Hara, meanwhile, provides a subtle portrayal of the upheaval suffered by children in wartime. The ghost of a murdered Victorian boy who she encounters in the attic of a country house at a Christmas party recalls the plight of evacuees removed from their families to alien and often hostile environments. And on the Sisyphean twist for the finale, released shortly after the 1945 election, Dead of Night was produced against a backdrop of what can be viewed as growing malaise, predicated on the fear that the war had ultimately torn nothing, and the ills of the past that led to the conflict would soon return, regardless of the balance of power in Westminster. This is reflected in the film's final, highly influential twist, that sees Walter Craig become trapped in the cycle of his dream, continuously reliving the events of the film, just as it seemed history might be doomed to endlessly repeat itself. Dead of Night drags its disparate elements together, a cosy fireside compendium of eclectic ghostly tales, then blows the whole thing up with a downbeat, bold and for the time daring finale. Its final 30 minutes is British horror at its finest and most inventive even 80 years later. Other films have broadly gone for this kind of storytelling structure before, but Dead of Night set the template for what was to come, effectively spawning a whole new genre. It is much imitated but rarely matched, and it's hard to give higher praise to a film that, while dated, still holds its own as an example of the form.
I knew you wouldn't leave me, Hugo. I knew you'd come back.
Not for long, my boy. Not for long.
Although it seems that many did not initially see the promise in such a form of filmmaking, with Dead of Night being only a modest success at the time, and there would be quite a wait for the next horror anthology film. In 1955, a full decade after Dead of Night, we find our next horror anthology, and even in that, only partly, with the rather sedate and minor 3 Cases of Murder. Credited to Alexander Korda's London Films, this actually seems to have been a production by their subsidiary, Ian Dalrymple's Wessex Film Productions, initially intended to produce high-minded literary adaptations, but stung by the failure of 1948's Esther Waters as well as a string of projects that failed to get off the ground, Dalrymple turned his focus to producing more crowd-pleasing work, often with low to mid-range budgets to mitigate financial risks. Opening with the cozy chills of In the Picture, an adaptation of Roderick Wilkinson's radio play of the same name, with the cute premise of an artist who figuratively and literally draws people into his artwork, and segueing into the supposed whodunit of You Killed Elizabeth, a clumsy adaptation of an episode of the early 1950s television anthology The Web, written by Brett Halliday, that scarcely deserved a big screen outing. The real star of this film is its final segment, an adaptation of Somerset Maugham's Lord Mondrago starring the great Orson Welles. According to Patrick McNee, who appeared in an incredibly small role, Welles wrestled control of the set from director George Morrow Farrell and effectively directed this segment, although aside from a few artfully done shots, this isn't really apparent in the production. There likely wasn't the budget for a 6-minute unbroken tracking shot or digging up the floor of the set to get a suitable low angle, and while it's certainly less stagey and more cinematic than the other two entries, it's not considerably so, and you shouldn't expect too much of Welles' masterly flair as it isn't really on display. He does, however, give a typically wonderful performance as the cold-hearted politician who is humiliated by a rival through his dreams, landing the bloviating bluster of this pompous parliamentarian, the comical abandon of his increasingly bizarre dreams.
Daisy, Daisy, give me your answer true. I'm half crazy over the love of you.
And the growing mania as his torments tell on his psyche. The first and particularly the last segments make this cheap British production worth a watch, although in truth it's about as inspiring as its on-the-nose title would suggest.
My dear young lady, why sing? And you can dance with me.
One aspect that is of interest going forward is its framing device, a jovial Eamon Andrews introducing each story.
Well, that's the way I'd like to do my murders. Short, sharp, and efficient.
Which is the first instance, although far from the last, of the wraparound being presented as coming from a narrator character. This is a stylistic choice the format began to use increasingly, and is perhaps indebted to EC Comics, particularly Tales from the Crypt, foregoing a narrative wraparound for a creepy curator of the chilling and cursed, recalling the comic book Crypt Keeper. This in turn was a riff on the omniscient narrator of radio serials and anthologies, such as the creaking door and creepy organ of Inner Sanctum Mysteries, and its iconic host Raymond, who very much provided the template for all of the Crypt Keeper type characters that came after.
Good evening, friends of the Inner Sanctum. This is your host, Raymond, the gay ghoul.
This format, coming as it did from the radio anthology and its standalone narratives, allowed for far more freedom in terms of the diversity of tales that could be told, as well as their tone, not bound to an overarching story. Although honestly, it never stopped any films that were attempting a more narrative framing story from taking some pretty large leaps regardless. Another hefty wait, although this time just 6 years to 1961, brought us The Devil's Messenger, which it almost feels like cheating to include as this was not a bespoke production, save for the always game Lon Chaney Jr.'s scenes in the wraparound, but a compendium of stories from the 1959 Swedish anthology series 13 Demon Street. The wraparound sees Chaney, the devil of the title, sending a recent retiree back to Earth on a series of errands.
The beautiful Devil's Messenger. Tell me exactly what happened.
Which leads to a series of completely unrelated stories. The Devil's Messenger is pretty flimsy, its short stories drag on, and the first two wrap up completely inexplicably.
His heart has stopped.
Opening with the weakest of its trilogy, a murderous photographer haunted by his misdeeds doesn't bode well, as its origins as a fairly cheap TV series really shine through. The second story, a group of scientists being surprisingly horny over a frozen woman.
But everybody will see her in her nakedness.
Why not? Why shouldn't we see her in her nakedness?
Is at least laughably bad in a way that may provide good riffing fodder for less high-minded channels.
I think I'll increase the temperature in this room. The ice will slowly melt and become transparent.
He's a scientist! While the third story, a man losing his mind after being warned of his imminent death by a fortune teller, is probably the most fun, but it's incredibly well-worn stuff even for 1961. before the whole thing ends with the devil breaking the fourth wall and causing a nuclear apocalypse for the hell of it, in an attempt to give the whole thing an atomic-era resonance that it really hasn't earned.
That formula is a 500 megaton bomb.
The next year's Tales of Terror sees the first instance of the truly ghoulish narrator, as this Roger Corman-helmed effort was lifted by narration from the velvet vocals of the legendary Vincent Price.
This is the beat of a human heart. Sit very still and listen.
Written by Richard Matheson, Tales of Terror is the fourth film in the Corman-Poe cycle, as the king of coming in on time and under budget drew inspiration from the Master of the Macabre no less than 8 times directly, usually with Price in a prominent role. Tales of Terror is 3 handsomely costumed but unconnected Poe adaptations, Corman's unfussy and economical direction giving the power of the film to its performers, particularly Price in a range of roles allowing him to flex his acting chops. In Morella, Matheson contorts Poe's brisk hymn to identity into a melancholic lament about grief, played out as a ghostly melodrama, as Price's distant, damaged alcoholic father finds out that evil wishes made when gripped with self-pity should never come true. The Black Cat is more comedic in tone and thankfully swaps the animal cruelty of Poe's story for a goofy tale of a wine-tasting competition that leads to cuckoldry and murder, as Peter Lorre's mean-spirited drunk enacts revenge on his unfaithful wife and her lover, the wine connoisseur Fortunato Lucrezi, an opportunity for flamboyance Price milks like the hammy old thesp he absolutely is. And we all love him for it, before the titular Black Cat proves the diminutive Dipso's downfall. While in the Facts in the Case of Monsieur Valdemar, Matheson takes Poe's thin literary hoax and gives us a more traditional evil scientist narrative, with Price taking something of a back seat in terms of the histrionics as the kindly dying Ernest Valdemar, to Basil Rathbone's theatrical turn as the creepy and intense mesmerist Dr. Carmichael, although he does eventually get his own back by turning into chocolate, so there is that. It could, perhaps, be a criticism that Matheson's interpretation of these slight Poe stories veer into somewhat formulaic territory to fill out their runtime, all 3 tales hinging on romantic complications largely absent from the original work, with an overarching theme about longing for that which you can't have. Whether you share that opinion, this is certainly one of the lesser works in the Corman-Poe cycle, but still plenty of fun as you would expect from all involved.
A draft from paradise.
That it is, that it is.
1 year later, in 1963, we got a fairly similar but far lesser film, again narrated by Price and again starring the Merchant of Venice in all 3 segments, but this time based on works by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Twice Told Tales is one of 2 films starring Price from Robert E. Kent's Admiral Productions in 1963, along with Diary of a Madman, with Kent himself on scripting duties for both. And while they were quickly made affairs, filming taking place over 2 or 3 weeks, these were relatively prestige projects for Kent, as he attempted to break away from the westerns, crime dramas and teeny bopper musicals he was most closely associated with, and branch out into more serious literary adaptations even if they were of a horror bent. Sadly, neither did as well as was expected, even with Price's name on posters that greatly exaggerated their horror bona fides. And within a year, Kent was once again back to making fairly generic westerns and teen-baiting musicals. In the director's chair was Sidney Salkow, a prolific helmer of genre B-movies in the truest sense of the term, shorter films that played as support for a main feature in cinemas, and who would work with Price again the following year in The Last Man on Earth, one of 3 films he pumped out in 1964 alone. Twice Told Tales is played very much straight, very old Hollywood, with not a hint of camp or cheese and even less Gru. Price noticeably dialed down in each of his roles, showing that he could be a serious thespian when he wanted to be. But that isn't necessarily for the better. No one really turns up to a Vincent Price movie expecting restraint and reverence for the material, but that is what we get here. The most showy role of the bunch belongs to the smooth English gent Sebastian Cabot, who forms a believably backslapping double act with Price as a pair of old friends in the first segment, Dr. Heidegger's Experiment, where an elixir of youth reignites old feelings and turns a firm friendship sour. This is probably the best story of the bunch, taking its time to establish its central relationship, which gives its final stretch a genuine heft, a gut punch that tells us the past is best left behind us. It is the only story of the 3 that truly earns its runtime, the film clocking in at a bum-numbing and mind-boggling 2 hours. In fact, it's really the only reason to watch the film at all, as the other 2 tales are complete washouts, Rappaccini's daughter, where Price is mad scientist who doesn't even seem all that mad, uses an acid plant to make his daughter poisonous to the touch, which sounds much more interesting than this laboured love story actually is. And The House of Seven Gables, a tired chamber piece where a smooth Price presides over a ghostly property dispute. And to be honest, I'm bored recounting even that much of its plot. It's well enough made, with an overarching theme of controlling men seeking to impose their will on women they see as little more than extensions of themselves running throughout. But it's badly misjudged, with a high-minded literary tone and earnest sensibility that barely attempts to be horror at all. A Sunday afternoon nap made manifest.
Well, you can drink that if you like. I need something more familiar. Whiskey.
In the same year, Italian horror legend Mario Bava brought us Black Sabbath, which is the first to fully embrace the use of a Crypt Keeper-style narrator, with Boris Karloff, used to the role thanks to his experience as the host of 2 seasons of the Anthology television series Thriller, introducing each tale in his own heavily imitated manner.
And now a few words about vampires.
Black Sabbath, and yes, it's where the band got their name from, is a strange one as multiple versions of the film exist, not just in different languages as was the norm for Italian cinema of the era, with films often being shot MOS or without live sound, ready to be dubbed into different languages for different markets afterwards, but in different edits, with some extra narration from Karloff, wildly differing soundtracks, and the stories being presented in a different order. The first tale in the English language version and the last in the original Italian release is The Drop of Water, and it's easily the best story of the trio, a fairly simple tale of a telltale water drop, elevated by Bava's superb visual flair, a kaleidoscopic haunting with one of the best corpse dummies around. Interestingly, this is credited by Karloff in his narration to Chekhov.
Yes, sir.
No? Well, maybe, because this bears no resemblance to any Chekhov story I'm aware of, and the bare minimum of internet sleuthing, I googled it, reveals that this tale is largely believed to be the work of little-known Italian writer and translator Franco Luzzentini. And I can't help but feel that Bava has done him somewhat dirty here, even if the story itself is fairly minimal. The second story in the English language version, and the first in the Italian version, is The Telephone, which is again somewhat slight as a woman is harassed by a possibly ghostly series of phone calls. Perhaps most notable in the differences between the two versions is the soundtrack, as the Italian version relies on a ticking clock to build tension and create a feeling of palpable paranoia. With occasional stings to highlight the more notably scary moments. While the English language version has a omnipresent, jazzy, almost spy cinema-inspired score that makes you think Matt Helm is going to leap out of a closet whiskey in hand at any moment. Fans of the Italian version tend to think this is the weakest of the stories, and maybe, but the kitschiness of the English language release's soundtrack is something of a strength in that regard, heightening a feeling of indelible 1960s quaintness that serves the segment well by comparison. The opposite is true of the Vordelak, the final segment of the English language version and the middle segment of the Italian release, based on a short story by Alexei Tolstoy. The story of a nobleman who stumbles across a family just as they are plunged into a nightmare by the return of their patriarch. Karloff having an absolute blast in the role. The Italian version has a quite somber mood that reflects the dark tone of a tale of a family torn apart by an evil presence wearing the face of a loved one, reflecting the origins of vampiric folklore as analogous to the Black Plague. While the English language version seems to think this is a Western or something? Black Sabbath's The Vordelak is something of a riff on the Hammer horror Dracula films that were doing well at the time, and fun enough with it, mixing European folklore with 60s gothic excess. There was also an adaptation of this story in 2023, Adrian Bowe and Hadrian Bouvier's The Vordelak, which I can't recommend enough. It's obviously unfair to compare a short segment from a 1963 anthology to a 2023 feature film, so I won't. But I will say that 2023's The Vordelak is one of my favourite horror films of the last few years. offering not just the obvious commentary on vampirism as an analogy to the plague, but also satirizing the romantic ideals of nobility, played dead straight in Black Sabbath, and perhaps offering a through line from the more traditional folkloric vampires to their later literary usage as representations of capital and elites. I'm sure connoisseurs will have a favourite between the two versions of Black Sabbath, but ultimately both are fantastic, and whichever you see, you're unlikely to be disappointed. Bava is recognised as one of the greats of Italian horror for good reason, and these simple tales are splendidly mixed and giddy concoctions of the maestro's calling cards, a flight of macabre martinis that go straight to your head.
Yes, I know all about that.
But anthology cinema was still seen as an aberration in terms of mainstream horror, something that was about to change with the creation of a new studio that did more to popularise the medium than anyone else. Among the influx of American film producers the UK saw in the 1960s, thanks to the Edie Plan, a tax on box office receipts that was funneled by the British Film Production Fund into financing films made on British and Commonwealth soil, were the film distributor Max Rosenberg and the writer Milton Subotsky. Although both had previously dabbled with horror, Rosenberg serving as an uncredited producer on Hammer Horror's The Curse of Frankenstein, and Subotsky having penned the cheap and cheesy City of the Dead, they were primarily known for their work on the teeny bopper musical Rock, Rock, Rock. Taking advantage of the incentives granted by the government to produce films in the UK, they established Amicus Productions, and continued in that vein, with teen-centric campy musical comedies It's Trad Dad and Just for Fun, before apparently being inspired by the relative successes of Black Sabbath and Tales of Terror to try their hand at a horror anthology. While Subotsky claims to have drawn influence from Dead of Night, and he sure did.
I think there is room for one more in here, is there not?
Far from being a labour of love or purely artistic endeavour, it was actually the savvy of Rosenberg that led to the production, as explained by Jeremy Dyson writing in The Guardian in 2018. He realised that an anthology had a cost advantage. A conventional narrative required actors to be booked for several weeks of production and paid accordingly, but each individual story could be shot in a few days. This meant Amicus could afford to punch well above its weight, attracting big marquee turns with a reasonable daily rate, then have their names on the poster to market the movie for a fraction of what it would normally cost to employ them. And so we are delivered the first Amicus horror anthology, written by Subotsky and directed by Freddie Francis, fresh off Hammer's success with The Evil of Frankenstein, centred around a fateful train journey and a series of fortunes told by Peter Cushing's metaphysicist Dr. Schreck.
Schreck is a German word, isn't it? It means fright, fear, something like that. The more exact translation would be terror.
To his star-studded collection of fellow travellers, a grouchy Christopher Lee, chipper Roy Castle, a buoyant Donald Sutherland, and Alan Freeman?
Cue music. Greetings, pop pickers.
This is honestly the weakest of the Amicus anthologies. Subotsky was a bit of a trashy, basic and unoriginal writer, and some of the stories are so forgettable and hokey that I'm not even going to bother mentioning them. While the Roy Castle-fronted segment, despite having a message about the consequences of cultural appropriation, is chock full of unpleasant stereotypes and has a depiction of West Indian culture that is, well, dated. Especially as this film was made at a time when West Indian immigrants were demonised and discriminated against in the UK as it was. And even in the context of voodoo as a horror trope that thoughtlessly served to other people of colour, this is particularly bad and seems to know it.
Hey, look at that monster.
But the film is not without its highlights, even if the first hour is varying degrees of begging you to turn it off. The fourth tale, where the wonderful Christopher Lee takes centre stage as an acid-tongued art critic who is haunted by the disembodied hand of an artist whose death he indirectly caused, played by the equally wonderful but sadly somewhat underused Michael Gough, is good fun, if incredibly derivative, Lee getting to oscillate between dead-eyed superciliousness and wide-eyed terror, with a surprisingly well-done detached hand effect for a low-budget horror of the time. It's also a reminder that these short horror stories are not simply about tapping into our fears of the monstrous or unknown, and there is a lot of fun to be had watching the worst among us getting a well-deserved supernatural comeuppance. It would probably be a lot less fun without Christopher Lee in the lead role, but it has Christopher Lee in the lead role, and similarly the fifth segment, where a newlywed begins to suspect his wife is secretly a vampire.
A vampire?
Has a fresh-faced Donald Sutherland elevating proceedings, alongside a suitably ambiguous Jennifer Jane, making a slow-paced and rather melodramatic tale lacking in discernible terror and failing to really drill into the paranoia of the premise. At least watchable, teaching us that good actors make mediocre material work in a way that Radio 1 DJs simply don't. We do also get the first sighting of the Amicus trope, the main characters realizing they've been dead all along and walking off into a foggy distance as the credits start to roll, a cool visual and thematic motif that is the ending to every Subotsky scripted effort. So that and Christopher Lee really are the best things here.
Well, I don't think there's very much more that we can say about that particular atrocity.
Amicus, of course, didn't only make horror anthologies, and while it is what they are best known for today, there were also adaptations of Doctor Who serials with Peter Cushing, bizarro precursor to Poor Things, The Mind of Mr. Soames. Hello, I'm Doug McClure, and you may remember me from adventures like The Land That Time Forgotten at the Earth's Core. And the studio also produced other horror offerings, including two particular favourites of mine. The Beast Must Die, a werewolf whodunit mashup with the funkiest soundtrack this side of Disco Town, as well as the brilliant and bizarre concept of a werewolf break, where the film literally stops to tell you it's your last chance to guess the identity of the werewolf hiding among its cast of genre favourites.
Have you guessed who the werewolf is? Is it Paul Foot? Jan?
And the Vincent Price starring gem Madhouse, where everyone's favourite horror ham gets the chance to go completely mad. Huh, I guess I just got the title. Which makes a perfect double bill of late-era Price with United Artists' gloriously campy Theatre of Blood. But we are here to look at their anthology films, and the success of Dr. Terror's House of Horrors made their next entry inevitable, leading to a film from 1967 with a name that I can't say on YouTube. Which is awkward. It's that, and I'm just going to call it The Garden. Apologies for the inconvenience. For The Garden, Subotsky and Rosenberg had the masterstroke of hiring the prolific and brilliant Robert Bloch. You don't get much closer to horror royalty than the guy who wrote the novel Psycho, but Bloch had been churning out horror long form and short for over 30 years by this point, and dipped into his back catalogue of the macabre and mysterious for adaptation here. There was also the coup of hiring Burgess Meredith to play Dr. Diablo. I think you can see where that's going to end up. All Barnum and Bailey bluster as the demonic greatest showman who promises his patrons the scare of their lives for a few extra Great British pounds. And he's joined by Jack Palance, queasily slimy as a devious and desperate Poe fanatic, playing off an understated Peter Cushing's button-down rival collector, and smirking smugly as he hovers in the background of the wraparound, thinking he knows far more than he does. The cast is rounded out by lesser-known but stalwart character actors, which is a real step up from DJs and trumpeters. Like John Standing, a supporting player in film and television who has rarely found himself out of work in the near 60 years since. And RSC veteran and award-winning stage actor Michael Bryant, excellent as the callous gadabout who falls under the spell of a demonic cat. Like Meredith and Palance, his background treading the boards allowed a series of long takes where they can be trusted with Bloch's sturdy dialogue, which was taken advantage of by returning director Freddie Francis, clearly enjoying the freedom the quintupled budget the success of Dr. Terror's House of Horrors allowed, and flexing the muscles that later made him a much sought-after cinematographer, working with the likes of Scorsese on Cape Fear and David Lynch on The Elephant Man, Dune and The Straight Story. From the understated grittiness of the carnival wraparound, the stylish obliqueness shown off in the more supernaturally slanted segments, to the noirish tradness of the creeping conspiracy of a Hollywood starlet finding out that her co-star isn't all that he seems to be. Francis is sure to leave his fingerprints all over every segment. But the real star of this film is Bloch's stories, a stark contrast to the well-worn sketches of Dr. Terror, not just finely crafted vignettes, but inventive, twisted ghost stories each with a fairly bonkers and memorable element, with a dash of ahead-of-its-time sci-fi thrown in for good measure, an overarching theme of wanting something so much you don't stop to ponder the price to be paid in having it weave throughout, fitting as snugly as scissors in a chest into the carnival barker's deal in the wraparound story. Overall, The Garden is an exemplary horror anthology, maybe Amicus's best, and is, at a minimum, its most consistent and diverse.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes our regular performance. But wait! There's more to come.
Next, in 1971, came The House That Dripped Blood, which is one of the truly great film titles, although sadly somewhat hamstrung by its either ambitious or unambitious, depending on how you look at it, conceit, that all of the stories are linked not by a true wraparound narrative, but by taking place in the same location, the titular house. It is also, strangely given its name, oddly lacking in any blood or grue, dripping or otherwise, and Peter Duffel's functional direction reflects his background in television, a stark contrast to Francis' more imaginative stylistic tics in the last Amicus anthology, giving this the feel of a cosy tea-time televisual chiller of the era. The star again are returning writer Robert Bloch's stories, maybe not as fun and diverse as the tales in the last Amicus efforts, but very clever, and actually quite deep at times in terms of the themes they are playing with. opening with the fantastic Denham Elliott as a horror author being haunted by his own creation, a premise that undoubtedly feels more trite and hoary watching now than it did in 1971, years before Stephen King's The Dark Half or the self-aware parody of Alan Wake. And closing with a comedic final segment as a self-absorbed, self-serious, egotistical and aloof ham horror thespian, the rubber-faced rogue John Pertwee, apparently basing his performance on Christopher Lee, although they were good friends so likely as a light-hearted jest, finds his cinematic roles threatening to become all too real. Both fun, metatextual narratives at a time when this was far less common in mainstream horror than it is today. And Pertwee trying to seduce the fabulous Ingrid Pitt in front of that portrait elicited a genuine belly laugh from me. The third segment too, where Lee's overbearing father butts heads with the excellent Nairi Dawn Porter as the nanny/tutor he is hired to look after his daughter, toys with the theme of witchcraft as symbolic of rebellion against patriarchal oppression, at a time when that idea was only just being subsumed into the growing feminist movement, often overtly as with the WITCH groups of socialist feminists that began springing up in the United States in the 1960s. And most of all, the second segment, Waxworks, which people usually make fun of for the somewhat effete sartorial choices of its leads and don't seem to give another thought, but which is, to me, the best story here, and one with a real thematic depth. And maybe it is just me, but far from just unusual costume choices, I feel like Peter Cushing's Philip and Joss Ackland's Neville are clearly coded as being gay.
Wife?
I beg your pardon?
Are you married?
No, I've never been married.
This was a film made in 1971, just 4 years after homosexuality was decriminalised in Britain, and prejudice against the LGBT community was not just still widespread, but institutionalised. So is there more to this tale of two confirmed bachelors, a pair of dandies fond of brightly coloured cravats, who always seem to be dancing around an idea of spending more time together?
Would you like to stay here tonight?
Oh, no, I should have left before now as it is. Philip, I'm sorry. It was silly of me. Take care of yourself.
And Salome as the woman they lust after is named, based on the biblical story, while historically a symbol of feminine seductiveness was given new meaning in an 1893 retelling by Oscar Wilde, banned for many years in the UK and not performed publicly in the country until 1931. Many saw the unfulfilled desire of that play as being symbolic of repressed sexual orientation, the character herself masculinized. So much so that in 2017 the Royal Shakespeare Company put on a version where Salome was presented as gender fluid and portrayed by a male performer. I should note here that not everyone agrees with this interpretation of Wilde's work, and some feel that many at the time simply looked for scandal where there was none, well, not of that kind anyway, and assumptions were made about the work because of homophobic prejudice Wilde suffered. But the play has long been embraced as an important example of LGBT theatre, as can be seen in the 1994 film A Man of No Importance, starring Albert Finney, which follows a closeted gay man in the 1960s, seeking to put on an amateur version of Salome as he comes to terms with his sexuality, while dealing with prejudice against the work and later himself. Whether intended by Bloch or not, and it is possible that much of this subtext was added in during uncredited rewrites in the segment by Russ Jones of American counterculture horror comic books Creepy and Eerie. Or maybe I'm simply reading too much into the film, putting 2 and 2 together and reaching 11:6. But for me, these aspects of the story give a real weight to this tale of lonely men from a generation who could never admit who they were, and a resonance to their tragedy as they face fierce reprisals when others learn of their desires. The most quaint and timid of Amicus's anthologies harbouring one of its most subversive and doleful tales. In general, while flawed, particularly as a horror film, The House That Dripped Blood is elevated by all of its segments being so exquisitely crafted. Bloch lifting stories from his vast back catalogue and adapting them in a way that was thematically deep and culturally relevant.
It's rather good, don't you think?
No,
Oh.
doesn't do you justice.
Next, in the UK at least, came 1972's Asylum, one of the more financially successful Amicus efforts, largely on the strength of a very well done wraparound story, where Robert Powell's Dr. Martin finds himself undergoing a very curious job interview, trying to ascertain which of the patients in this asylum for the incurably insane is the former head of the facility, who has himself apparently lost his marbles to the extent that premise makes sense. This clever little wraparound was based on a short story the again returning Robert Bloch had written as an entry for a contest run by Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine, which had also been expanded into an hour-long episode of Alfred Hitchcock Presents in 1963 starring Ray Milland. It's intense and well done, played with real gravitas by Powell in particular, taking things wonderfully seriously, and has 2 gut-punching twists as stings in its tail. It is also elevated by a bombastic orchestral score and by veteran director Roy Ward Baker, who gives this somewhat schlocky premise a very traditional and measured feel. This was the last Amicus anthology on which Bloch served as writer, and despite my unreserved praise for his efforts in all of his Amicus films, maybe that's for the best, as outside of the wraparound the well seems to have run a little dry, and the majority of the segments are fairly underwhelming filler. The first, Richard Todd's racist philanderer murdering his wife, chopping her into pieces and dumping her remains in a freezer, before meeting his comeuppance as a voodoo charm brings her body parts back to vengeful life, drags. As does the third, despite a tour de force from Charlotte Rampling, as a mentally unwell woman whose imaginary friend, the ever-charismatic Britt Ekland, leads her into trouble, a story that tips its hand far too early for its final twist to actually work. Somewhat better is the vignette where Barry Morse's struggling immigrant tailor agrees to make a supernatural suit for Peter Cushing's mysterious stranger. And although it is easy to praise the effort of all involved in attempting to make this work, you are left with a feeling of a story spread far too thin and coming apart at the seams. While the most memorable segment is actually the briefest, as the irrepressible Herbert Lom's mad doctor takes control of a murderous doll bearing his face, which absolutely terrified me as a child, but as an adult watching it now, it's a Robotron toy, remember those? With Herbert Lom's head? And it's kind of hilarious. Although it is a nice touch to have this story essentially break out, both literally as the little mannequin leaves Dr. Byron's consciousness free to enact his revenge, and figuratively as it invades the wraparound narrative. But I feel like they clearly only had Lom for a day at most, as he gives one speech in his inimitable fashion, then does some intense eyes in close-up. No one does intense eyes better than Herbert Lom, and that's about it, which reflects a somewhat rushed production, the whole thing being shot in around 3 weeks. While it's a mixed bag, it is among the most fondly remembered of the Amicus anthologies, which is maybe partly down to the frame story being both strong and evocative of the film's title, and maybe partly down to its weakest elements being so incredibly forgettable.
I can turn it on and you'll say, oh yes, it operates on batteries. But how do you know what it is?
The same year brought us a second Amicus anthology, although Tales from the Crypt was actually completed before Asylum and was released first in the United States. For this film, Amicus struck a deal with EC Comics, allowing them to adapt tales from their immeasurable back catalogue. And the tone for Tales from the Crypt and its follow-up, The Vault of Horror, is certainly different from the more studied style of Bloch. These are quick, lurid tales of terror that whiz by in a flash, enough so to up the segment quotient from 4 to 5 and still manage to be telling the characters they've been dead the entire time and have them wandering off to accept their fates in a breezy 90 minutes. Sapolsky is back in the writer's chair, and despite my unkindness towards his writing earlier, this is not a weakness. He merely has to get out of the way of stories cherry-picked from the EC oeuvre. And in fact, these stories being somewhat underwritten adds to the hokey charm, as they zoom by, carried by the strength of their premise. This is perhaps best seen in the fourth segment, Wish You Were Here, a self-aware riff on the monkey's paw fable that cuts right to the chase and keeps heightening hysterically, in a manner that seems acutely aware of its own self-parody.
I wish to bring back as he was immediately before the accident, but he was already dead from a heart attack, so the accident didn't kill him.
This may be an example of what could well be termed bad writing, or at least writing that is uninspired and on the nose, actually working in the film's benefit, as the instant ludicrous turnarounds become darkly funny instead of eye-rolling. For the wraparound plot, a group get lost in torchlit catacombs while sightseeing on a tour of a graveyard, which is a thing you'd get dolled up in your Sunday best to do in the 70s, I guess, when they stumble across Ralph Richardson's creepy crypt keeper.
And what are your plans when you leave here? Plans?
And I don't know what's going on with Sir Ralph here, but he is completely checked out, and it's hilarious.
Who's next? Perhaps you?
Freddie Francis is back in the director's chair and gives all of the segments as well as the wraparound a distinct visual feel, like the chintzy 70s-era hominess of the first segment, all gaudy wallpapers and impractical rugs, as murderous yummy mummy Joan Collins' Christmas surprise for her husband unfurls as she is tormented by an insane asylum escapee dressed as Santa, to a soundtrack of incongruous carols, a real Christmas cracker of hokey chills. Or the second story where a cheating husband has a fatal car crash while leaving his wife, and returns as a kind of zombie, largely expressed through first-person perspective camera work, horror derived from the reactions of others to his state. We also get more Peter Cushing, who is always welcome on my screen, and while he is rightly regarded as a genre legend, I feel he doesn't get the due he deserves as a performer capable of both variety and nuance. So it's wonderful to see him here playing delightfully against type as a lovable widowed bin man with a penchant for dabbling in the occult, whose snooty neighbours drive to an early grave. And that's another little treat in these anthologies that the format allows established but often somewhat typecast actors to show their range, like Cushing here or incumbent Doctor Who John Pertwee in The House That Dripped Blood, although it sadly isn't taken advantage of often enough. The standout segment is saved for last with Blind Alley, based on a comic strip by Al Feldstein, maybe better known for his work on the snarky, satirical and goofy Mad magazine than his horror stories. A bracing us versus them fable with nary a supernatural element, as a retired army major takes over a home for the blind, and inflicts a brutal austerity on his charges, rationing food, heat and even blankets, while he dines on fireside steak dinners, leading to a rebellion against his regime and an elaborate punishment that wouldn't be out of place in the Saw series of films, which Francis handles with typical flair. Overall, Tales from the Crypt is a roaring good time, with a seam of class consciousness seeping through from its origins in American counterculture comic books, while never forgetting that its job first and foremost is to be a breathless compendium of horror silliness.
What have you done?
I wished him alive again, forever.
But don't you realize he's been embalmed? His veins are filled with embalming fluid burning into him.
Oh, no!
The next year saw Amicus return to the EC well with 1973's The Vault of Horror, although to less fun effect for a variety of reasons. Where the breeziness of Tales from the Crypt was a strength, here it reeks of laziness, perhaps best illustrated by the wraparound, which is simply 5 people getting into a lift, or elevator for the Americans who may end up watching this, and milling around as overly dramatic music plays. They then find that they have been delivered to a mysterious sub-basement, so they crack open the whiskey, it was the 70s after all, and start telling each other about their worst nightmares without even taking the time to introduce themselves. No how do you do's? Queen Elizabeth is spinning in her grave, my good sirs. With a stuff just happens, roll with it bro vibe like that, I don't think I need to mention that Milton Subotsky was back behind the typewriter keys for this effort. And it isn't just that the wraparound is so weak as a narrative as to be basically non-existent. The stories of the segments really aren't that great either. There must surely have been a better tale in the EC back catalogue than the convoluted and contrived fable of a man who fakes his own death for the life insurance but is double-crossed by his partner and left buried, leading to several other nonsensical plot twists that may have worked in a comic book but feel rushed on screen. And even if that was a tale Subotsky truly wished to bring to life, surely it could have been better delivered than the "and then this happened" manner it is here. Similarly, the tale of a murderer who finds himself dining at a restaurant for vampires isn't a bad idea, but in execution it lacks tension or any establishing of the premise. What might have been a fun couple of pages in a comic book with a macabre twist is sadly lacking as a piece of cinema, ultimately little more than an underdeveloped sketch. There are also not one, but 2 stories that fall into cliché tropes and unpleasant stereotypes. Kurt Jürgens is a magician travelling the world looking for magic tricks to steal through means fair or foul, a critique of soft colonialism and cultural appropriation that falls into the trap of exotification itself, and Tom Baker, fresh off his breakout role as Rasputin in 1971's Nicholas and Alexandra, and soon to go on to become the greatest Doctor Who, as a painter using voodoo to enact revenge on those who have swindled him. There's only so many ways I can say it's of its time, especially as I am not of that time and I'm watching it now. You may not care and wish to hand-wave it away, but I do. Through a modern lens, these stereotype-laden segments are uncomfortable viewing, not least because the best stories among the many I've watched here haven't needed to use them. For what it's worth, even putting that aside, these aren't great stories either, and the vengeful artist story in particular simply didn't need that device, and its inverted Dorian Gray narrative probably would have functioned better without it. It's a shame, as Jürgens and particularly Baker, who is an absolute force of nature as a performer, deserved better than this trope. And perhaps it is telling that none of the horror regulars who usually populate these films found themselves available when this script was doing the rounds. The best story of the bunch is the second, with British comedy's greatest scoundrel Terry Thomas, showing off his unique mastery of tics and quirks as an unbearable snooty compulsive, who nags his nervous new wife, a wonderful Glynis Johns, until she leaves him tidied away as neatly as he likes his possessions. But even here it's a tail light on horror, almost sitcom-esque in tone until its gruesome ending, which, yes, is the point. And it is in fact not an adaptation of one of EC's horror efforts, but from their sister publication, Shock and Suspense Stories. But that makes it an odd choice for inclusion in this horror anthology, although it glides by on the presence and charisma of its 2 stars, giving the characters depth through the strength of their performances and chemistry that would make Herbert West proud. To wrap things up, the protagonists realise they've been dead all along and walk off to accept their fates as the credits roll, and I don't care how many times Subotsky reused that ending, it's super cool. although maybe the film could have done without using the same musical sting as the closing credits of Asylum on top of that. There's nothing wrong with motifs, but at a certain point it just becomes cannibalizing your earlier work. There was a general feeling of laziness about the Vault of Horror, a collection of stories tossed together with little thought or care, although I should exclude the performers from that, most of whom do their best with what they are given, as well as director Roy Ward Baker back after the success of Asylum, as he brings his traditional and classical style to bear on the film, with some shots being quite striking compositions. But even in that, these weren't particularly stories that needed that as an aesthetic, crying out for a much lighter or more dynamic touch, making them oddly ponderous for the short and sweet bursts of silliness they were clearly intended to be.
Can't you do anything neatly? Can't you? Can't you do anything neatly? Can't you do anything neatly?
The Vault of Horror specifically, and Amicus anthologies in general, were the subject of a spoofing in an episode of Steve Coogan's 2001 TV series Dr. Terrible's House of Horrible, which parodied classic British horror of various stripes. I'm not going to say it was especially good, but it was, by far, the best episode of a TV show that was sadly a real missed opportunity, seemingly far more interested in cheesy jokes than drawing humour out of its premise. In 1974, Amicus brought us From Beyond the Grave, based on short stories by R. Chetwynd Hayes, and adapted by a fairly inexperienced bunch. First-time writers Robin Clark, who went on to be a Hollywood music editor, and Raymond Christodoulou, who went on to be a commercial script editor, as well as Kevin Conner, a film director making his directing debut, whose most notable credit after this was the delightfully trashy horror spoof Motel Hell. The wraparound story here is very cute, as Peter Cushing's antique shop owner sells bric-a-brac and objet d'art to each of our protagonists in turn, setting their individual narratives going, and his antique dealer peddling items that come at a far dearer cost than they initially appear was almost certainly an influence on Stephen King's Needful Things.
Lots of bargains, all tastes catered for. Oh, and a big novelty surprise goes with every purchase.
From Beyond the Grave is much darker than the last few Amicus films, maybe the darkest effort by the studio, generally concerned with slower-paced, slow-burn psychological horror, leisurely stories concerned with character building and often harsh payoffs. Highlights include David Warner dealing with a haunted mirror demanding sacrifices, perhaps the best segment of the film, with Warner growing visibly haggard as the psychological toll of his dark compulsion tells on him, and the phenomenal Margaret Leighton having an absolute blast as the psychic Madame Orloff, called in to exercise an elemental spirit wreaking havoc on Ian Carmichael's somewhat slimy stockbroker. It is, maybe intentionally, as much of a throwback as the antiques Cushing's shop owner peddles. The end of a cycle, but also a return to its roots. A well-written, well-performed, well-made, but somewhat staid and unadventurous collection of old-fashioned ghost stories, preying on middle-class anxieties as middle managers, stockbrokers, and writers find the occult invading their well-to-do lives through dusty antiques. Old magics and forgotten spirits that our comfortable modernity leaves us unequipped to deal with. The only potential salvation, a goodness of spirit that not all of us possess.
There's an elemental on your shoulder.
This was sadly the last of the Amicus anthologies, at least for the studio in its original form, as an economic downturn in the UK precipitated by the oil crisis of 1974 led to a decade of stagnation. Amicus, who were reliant on film-to-film funding to get by, were particularly vulnerable as cinema attendance dwindled through the decade. But not uniquely so, as their competitor Hammer Studios also faced hardship, going into liquidation in 1979. Amicus Productions limped on for a few more years, mostly producing action-adventure fare, but folded in 1977. There was, however, one spiritual successor, as Subotsky without Rosenberg produced One Last Hurrah, with returning director Roy Ward Baker. 1981's The Monster Club, the final film for both, which was sadly a disappointing whimper rather than the promised monstrous roar. The wraparound story is actually rather faithfully lifted from R. Chetwynd Hayes' 1976 slyly comedic horror anthology of the same name. These segments themselves are rather looser adaptations of two of the vignettes from the novel, while the other is a jazzed-up adaptation of his short story My Mother Married a Vampire, which can be found in the imaginatively titled collection The Vampire Stories of R. Chetwynd Hayes. And as a piece of trivia that will be of interest to me and me alone, has the exact same cover art as the fighting fantasy choose-your-own-adventure game book Vault of the Vampire. As a broad theme, the film centers around the idea that monsters suffer from the same racism and discrimination as minorities, that humans are the true monsters because of our predilection for prejudice and oppression, and yeah, I actually think that's great. The whole idea that monsters are demonized in fiction as an analogy to prejudice in general, something that was a fixture of Chetwynd Hayes' work, is a clever way to shine a light on the way stereotypes and tropes seep through into works of art. That those whose cultures are perhaps less known to creatives and audiences are too often lazily othered to create boogeymen. I'm glad Subotsky apparently finally recognised it and chose to make a work of art reflecting it. And any viewer of this video who has been angrily typing out a comment about not judging works of art that do so should just go and watch The Monster Club instead. Actually don't, I wouldn't wish B.A. Robertson on anyone. But the point stands. The Monster Club finds John Carradine playing Chetwynd Hayes himself, and I should point out the novel wasn't that self-indulgent and this was a change made for the film, who befriends Vincent Price's famished vampire Aramis after allowing him to briefly snack on his jugular, and is taken as the cheery vamp's guest to the titular Monster Club, a groovy hangout where vampires, werewolves and ghouls jam out to monster-themed songs from the most affordable hitmakers of the day. This is a film that finds itself horribly dated, not just in this new wave-infused hotspot for creatures of the night, but also in terms of the segments themselves, with both not just incredibly old hat even on release, but clashing tonally with each other. While the wraparound tries and fails to be light, groovy and hip, the stories are largely cosy and earnest post-war fare, although the second segment inexplicably becomes a Benny Hill sketch towards its climax, complete with weird sound effects and pratfalls. This film came out in 1981, 3 years after Halloween, 1 year after The Shining, and the same year as The Evil Dead, The Howling, and An American Werewolf in London. It's indicative of a film that has no idea how to connect with an audience, and just throws everything it has at the wall and hopes some of it makes a satisfying splatter. If there is a bright spark amongst this concussion-inducing tonal whiplash, it's the final segment as Stuart Whitman's self-absorbed film director is trapped in a remote village by its population of ghouls. An effective enough tale that commits to its claustrophobic premise, and plays out as a more modern variation on traditional horror anthology short stories, with neat illustrations recalling those found in EC comic books and an effectively creepy synth-heavy score. You can't help but feel that if the other segments had matched this tone and tempo, perhaps The Monster Club would have been more fondly remembered, even with the ludicrous campiness of the framed story.
Well, I can get you material for your next book.
Material? What sort of material?
Of course, that isn't necessarily the last we'll hear of Amicus Productions, as the studio has been resurrected by Scottish director Laurie Brewster and Subotsky's son, Sergei. And although we can't be exactly sure of the quality of their upcoming crowdfunded effort In the Grip of Terror, and Brewster is best known for a slew of underwhelming straight-to-VOD throwback nonsense, I will say I'm rooting for them. But before we go on, as I've bunched all of the Amicus anthologies together, I've skipped a few films, so to catch up we'll need to rewind all the way back to 1967. 1967's Dr. Terror's Gallery of Horrors, which, due to its obviously copyright-infringing name, goes by a slew of other titles, that I simply can't be bothered listing because this film is absolute bottom-of-the-barrel dreck. Narrated by John Carradine, who got gussied up in his finest tux to stand in front of that picture and deliver nonsensical waffle like Grandpa Simpson having a stroke.
Various things were used to exorcise these evil creatures, such as holy symbols, certain herbs, and a few metals. We of more modern times, with our better educations, communications, and police forces, are inclined to scoff at things we do not understand.
Gallery of Horror is occasionally so bad that it becomes funny.
I know it looks bad, but I killed a dog.
Say, I've just got a funny idea.
Really not in the mood for funny ideas, John.
No, but suppose King Vampire isn't a king at all.
You know, you're not making sense.
But it's largely just an interminable slog, weird, stilted dialogue delivered by actors who either don't know or don't care what they are doing. Sets that are somehow less wooden and more lively than the cast. Direction that amounts to having a camera, when it isn't lifting footage directly from Corman's Poe films. Plots that ask the question, wait, what's going on?
Yes, I know your secret, and I know why you were sent here. But you'll not succeed. I'll see to that.
No, you don't know the curse. You'll kill us all.
All brought together by an overbearing soundtrack of stock music.
Tristram Halvin died 1673.
This is a film that may as well have been made solely so the Mystery Science Theatre guys could riff over it, and even they probably rejected it for just being too easy. Maybe I should caveat this criticism with one thing, an appearance by Lon Chaney Jr., terrifically game even in this sea of crap. a consummate pro turning his performance on a pin, and the Frankenstein Come Reanimator segment that features him is easily the best thing here, well, in a non-ironic way anyway. If you like watching bad movies with a few friends, then this may be something you should seek out, but otherwise this is a compendium of duds that really ought to remain buried.
Mr. Harker, you are much too clever for your own good. And now for your meddling, you shall have to pay.
I won't let you drain this village of its blood. I need it for myself.
A werewolf!
1968 brought us the most prestigious of the anthologies of this period, the French-Italian co-production Spirits of the Dead, also known as Tales of Mystery and Imagination, which brought together three legendary film directors, Roger Vadim, Louis Malle, and Federico Fellini, each taking a stylish stab at adapting a story from the pen of the master himself, Edgar Allan Poe. Opening with Vadim's rather loose adaptation of Poe's Metzengerstein, which is simultaneously achingly 60s but also stuffily old-fashioned, taking place in a world that could easily be anywhere from medieval times onwards, while also being anachronistically retro-futuristic, Vadim crafting a timeless fable lusciously costumed and artfully composed. A tale of elites led by Jane Fonda's Countess Frederique, tormenting anyone lesser for no reason other than petty whims and to show their dominance, sadistic libertines living lives of decadence and gluttony that leave them achingly bored, cruelty handed down as easily as scraps from their table, Vadim filming primarily in real ruins, not just giving this segment a period luster but also illustrating a decay that mirrors that of these characters' morality. When one of her petty tricks turns deadly, the Countess devotes her life to a seemingly untamable horse, perhaps as penance or perhaps through grief at what she has lost. Roger Corman could probably have told this tale in half the time and for a tenth of the budget, likely while making two other films with leftover short ends after everyone else had gone home. But Vadim's success plays nicely into its themes. The arrogance of thinking you can tame anything, bend nature to your will, so used to absolute power you feel able to control the very elements, acting without thinking of the consequences. Fonda is dead-eyed but radiant as the Countess who doesn't realise that in breaking this untamable beast, it is her will that is being broken, and unlike Poe's tale, she faces her penance willingly. A grave tale of spite and regret delivered with a real visual flair. The second segment, William Wilson, is a more faithful and straightforward adaptation, taking the form of a confession by Alain Delon's deranged bully to a priest, Malle keeping the spirit of Poe's tale of the same name, but reworking it into a treatise on the dangers of toxic masculinity. Wilson a man with so little good in him that the good manifested alongside him, and in doing so, became his nemesis. Its big set piece is an expertly staged and wonderfully tense card game, as Wilson's status and skill at cheating the system eventually tell, before his doppelganger ruins the party. Perhaps the weakest and most straightforward tale, but worthwhile nonetheless. The third segment, Toby Dammit, finds Fellini adapting Poe's Never Bet the Devil Your Head, and recentering it as a modern-day satire on celebrity. Arriving in a Rome that is bathed in a post-apocalyptic amber hue, Stamp's pallid alcoholic actor, channeling our old friend Conrad Veidt's The Man Who Laughs, finds himself in an obscurantist fever dream, as Fellini delivers a mishmash of expressionism and psychedelia. Stamp's Dammit finding that the price you pay for this specific kind of immortality is your dignity and your sanity, a childish dream that comes at the cost of your soul, a nightmarish and inescapable trap with only one off-ramp. Spirits of the Dead is, obviously given the talent both behind and in front of the camera, a masterfully done anthology. While far from the best work of anyone involved, that is barely a criticism. Most tend to focus on Fellini's segment as being the best, and it is easily the most memorable, slyly comedic and queasily nightmarish. But all of the stories are superior work and deftly delivered.
Evidently the critics didn't understand it.
1969's The Night Gallery is not so much a horror anthology as a pilot for a horror anthology TV show. And really I'm including it for the sake of completionism rather than because it's an outstanding effort in its own right. The great Rod Serling not only provides bridging narration for these three stories linked by paintings, but also served as writer, as he would for much of the TV show that followed. Serling's way with tight plotting, devilish twists and sure dialogue are all on full display, ably enacted by a steady cast of TV favourites, including Roddy McDowall, Ossie Davis and, far too briefly, Tom Bosley. But while these are all fun little segments, they are very much televisual fare, entertaining half-hour plays that start to drag a touch when watched as a feature. Night Gallery isn't as fondly remembered as The Twilight Zone, and while there is nothing wrong with anything here beyond the constraints of the medium, it's hard to say it stands out either, especially compared to Serling's best work. It is best remembered today for the second segment, Eyes, not because its quality is noticeably higher, but for being the first directorial effort of some guy called Steven Spielberg? Already showing off the clever visual trickery that marked him out as a wonderkind. and for being one of the final on-screen appearances of Joan Crawford, who absolutely smashes her role as a wealthy blind woman willing to go to any lengths to see again, however briefly, a reminder of the talent that made her a great of Hollywood's golden age.
I want to see something. Trees, concrete, buildings, grass, airplanes, color!
1972 brought us Encounters with the Unknown, a cheap and amateurish offering from Arkansas-based filmmaker Harry Thomason, who went on to create the Burt Reynolds sitcom Evening Shade with his future wife, Linda Bloodworth Thomason. Rod Serling appears again, here only as narrator, although I think it's clear that he rewrote his lines for that role, as they are of a massively different caliber to everything else, with his presence, however slight, greatly elevating the dreary proceedings. A purportedly true retelling of the case files of fictional parapsychologist Dr. Jonathan Rankin. Besides Serling and a very professional soundtrack, there is nothing else of note here at all. It's staid pacing and incessant repetition making this a real chore to sit through. You get the feeling that everything here could have been wrapped up in 10 minutes without all the padding, and, in fact, the film proves it can by retelling everything we've seen so far in the closing 10 minutes, presumably to bump the runtime up to a nice round hour and a half to make it more sellable on the grindhouse and drive-in circuits.
Listen you well to my word.
Moving on to 1973 and attempting to cash in on the Amicus-inspired craze for anthology horror, or at least realising that these were relative economic sure things, we find Tales That Witness Madness. Credited to John Heyman's World Film Services, which was less a film studio itself and more an entity to facilitate structured financing and take advantage of financial incentives for producing films in the UK, largely working with established film studios to spread costs and mitigate financial risks. Indeed, this seems to have been largely a Paramount production, with director Freddie Francis claiming the financing was chiefly from then Paramount Studios president Frank Yablans. And yes, Freddie Francis is back behind the camera, looking to replicate the jolly good fun he delivered for so many Amicus anthologies. The script for Tales That Witness Madness is credited to Jay Fairbanks, actually actress Jennifer Jane, who you may remember from an appearance in Dr. Terror's House of Horrors as Donald Sutherland's potentially vampiric spouse.
A vampire?
And who moved into screenwriting as her leading lady days trailed off. With this and the hopelessly weird and weirdly hopeless Harry Nilsson and Ringo Starr musical The Son of Dracula. The wraparound finds stiff-upper-lipped British leading man Jack Hawkins being introduced by a strangely subdued Donald Pleasance to a group of mental patients he has supposedly cured, which is perfectly fine as an introduction for a series of horror stories, but basically the exact same setup as the previous year's Asylum, which leaves a flavour of this film being somewhat derivative. It's maybe not helped by having Hawkins, who lost his larynx to throat cancer in 1965, in such a prominent role, particularly as his delivery sometimes leaves Charles Gray, who dubbed his voice for this and many other films, sounding like there is a full stop between every word.
All 4 cases resolved at last.
I really don't want to be cruel or poke fun here. Hawkins was brave to recover from such a horrific setback and keep on acting, while Charles Gray does his best. But it's awkward to watch and so carelessly done that it becomes a detriment to the film.
Then show me. Your findings must be seen to be believed.
Tales That Witness Madness generally treats its vignettes with a lot of care, largely very tidily constructed psychodramas that are more concerned with recognisable neuroses and fears than with terror itself, which is admirable. But as a horror film, even one of this era, it lacks the chills to go with its emotional heft. The highlight of the film is its third segment, Mel, as British stalwart character actor Michael Jaston brings home an anthropomorphic tree, much to the displeasure of his wife, a glorious Joan Collins. A cosy but compelling tale of obsession and jealousy elevated by nuanced turns by its leads, with a couple of ahead-of-its-time visual touches and a nicely done thorny final twist. As a lowlight, the film's final segment, Luau, which dabbles in anecdotification I think I've made my feelings clear on, and wastes future Doctor Who companion Mary Tam as a ditzy ingenue, in the shadow of a ludicrously overacting Kim Novak and a thoroughly stale narrative of sacrifices to Hawaiian gods. Not just bad, but boring. Tales That Witness Madness has a general air of fustiness that is hard to escape. Despite some clever touches and good storytelling, it is minor in every way that matters. Probably enough to scratch an itch for more of this kind of film while not being an especially entertaining example.
Want one?
Sure, we might as well both get smashed if you're really looking for trouble.
1975 brought us the made-for-television trilogy of terror, from the creator of horror soap opera Dark Shadows, Dan Curtis. Shorn of a wraparound and getting straight down to business, we're delivered 3 unconnected Richard Matheson stories adapted for the screen by Matheson himself and the prolific William F. Nolan, best known for the Logan's Run series of books. Trilogy of Terror is really only remembered for its 3rd segment, but I'll deal with the opening 2 tales first. Theatrical and character-driven stories that showcase the versatility of star Karen Black, but which are hamstrung by a boxy, plain aesthetic, with a focus on writing and performance that makes it a rather dull watch for much of its runtime, especially as both stories tip their hands far too early. Black really does do a great job in her roles here, often carrying scenes completely on her own, and it is something of a shame that all of the characters she plays are basically different types of sexist stereotype elevated by her range and charisma. Then there is the 3rd tale, Amelia, where our leading lady is terrorized by a small doll, and it is entirely possible you could want to skip the next few minutes of this video, because this doll is stunningly racist. Not even the exotification I've complained about before, where creators have fallen into racist tropes, although it is also very much that. Because this is the doll, this really is just an appalling racist caricature terrorizing a white woman with a knife, clearly attempting to prey on racist fears of minorities prevalent in America at that time, and it is shockingly unsubtle about it. I'm sure some could wish to handwave this away for some reason, and I'm aware that this segment is fondly remembered, to the extent that the doll prop sold for over $200,000 at auction in 2019. Fond memories I don't share, as watching the film for this video was my introduction, although I will concede that once the story explodes into action, it is very well made. It has a real visual flair, particularly in contrast to the dullness of the previous segments. Point-of-view shots that predate The Evil Dead, fast movements that mean we often only catch fleeting glimpses of this murderous doll, ably displaying why this 2 foot of terror would be a threat, clearly an inspiration for the Child's Play series of films. Seeing this absolute nightmare fuel on television in 1975 must have been quite the trip, especially compared to the sedate psychological horror of the first 2 segments. But the depiction of the doll isn't just racist now, it was racist in 1975. Racist fears are exactly what was always being exploited. Its stylistic influence on future horror media is apparent, as is that it clearly terrified a generation of children who may well remember that feeling with warm nostalgia. But I simply don't know how to uncouple this being well-made horror from the blunt fact of its appalling racism, and I am really of no mind to try. I cannot believe this aired on network television no matter how long ago, and I also cannot believe there was a sequel in 1996 where Curtis brought this exact doll back, which there was, with that seemingly being the entire selling point of the whole wretched project. That sequel, the predictably titled Trilogy of Terror 2, is a cheaply made straight-to-cable offering, which wastes Lizette Anthony taking Black's place as lead in all of the segments, on 2 rather rote tales and a direct sequel/broad remake of the killer doll story, now transplanted to a museum, which keeps the original's gross racism while losing the inventiveness and claustrophobia that made it scary. A dull hour and a half that really doesn't deserve even this much time being spent on it. The second of the stories from this sequel, titled Bobby, is actually a direct-to-the-point of slavishness remake of the best story from Curtis's 1977 follow-up to Trilogy of Terror, Dead of Night, which has nothing to do with the earlier film of that title. And this tale of a grieving mother bringing her son back from the dead, with predictably disastrous consequences being its highlight, speaks to a distinct lack of quality. The other segments, a time-travelling Ed Begley Jr. monologuing endlessly in a story that is all tell and no show, and a Patrick McNee starring tailored suspected vampirism that takes a long time to get to its inevitable twist, are so forgettable that I've forgotten them already, so I guess we'll just have to move on.
Why don't you just get the hell out of our lives? Don't phone us and don't call on us. Well, leave! And don't ever come back here!
Our old friend Milton Subotsky is back as producer in a non-Amicus capacity, with The Uncanny from 1977, a Canadian-British co-production directed by Denis Heroux, from stories by jobbing horror writer and noted curator of literary anthologies, Michel Parry, that are linked by the concept of cats as a supernatural entity who are the masters of mankind. Parry evidently had an interest in this as a concept. One of the anthology books he served as an editor for was Beware of the Cat, which collected feline-themed horror shorts from writers such as H.P. Lovecraft and Ramsey Campbell, as well as The Hounds of Hell, which similarly focused on the dogs of horror fiction, and The Roots of Evil on pernicious plant life. Parry himself is both the greatest strength and weakness of the uncanny. These are classic Gothic fables of greed or arrogance leading to a downfall, drawn from the literary tradition of the anthologies for which he was famed. But they are also very dated even for 1977, old-fashioned in tone and execution. Horror changed a great deal in the 1970s. The Exorcist, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Carrie, and The Uncanny is the best example of the horror anthology falling behind horror trends, a genre stuck in the past and losing its audience, which perhaps explains its poor performance at the box office. For a lover of the form, and especially anthologies of this kind, it has its moments, particularly in the final segment featuring a deliciously hammy Donald Pleasance. Although the whole project is somewhat undone by its premise insisting that cats are super scary, when they are actually super cute. Fluffy little boys and gals with adorable little noses, who deserve a treat and a belly rub, even when they are eating your rotting corpse. Our wraparound finds an agitated Peter Cushing trying to convince Ray Milland that these small boys are totally evil, by telling him stories where the moral is, don't be a dick to cats. And I for one welcome both that as a message for a film and our new fluffy overlords. It's almost impossible to get through this film without sighing, "Aww," at these consistently cuddly little floofs. And although this exact scene has occurred in my house, it was not in terror.
Come and see this!
1978's The House of the Dead, also apparently known as Alien Zone, although I have absolutely no idea why, sees a mortician taking a lost adulterer in from the rain and telling him the stories of 4 recent arrivals. Directed by Sharon Miller, who would go on to be one of the most celebrated televisual directors of the 80s. Working from a script by David O'Malley, future writer of the 80s cheese fest The Boogans, and Armand Assante erotic thriller parody Fatal Instinct. The House of the Dead is actually something of a rough diamond, if you manage to get through its incredibly weak opening segment about a child-hating teacher, which even the film has the good sense to know is terrible.
You don't expect me to believe that story. It's ridiculous.
Perhaps.
Its second story is a haunting, difficult twist on a Peeping Tom-esque serial killer, shown primarily through a single static camera that he plays each of his murders out for, intercut with snippets of footage from his later arrest. This works well as it is, but is also sadly far too brief, rushing through a concept that could have sustained far longer, however grim that may have been. The absolute highlight of the film sees a police detective who is effectively Columbo by way of Nero Wolfe, facing off with a smarmy mashup of Sherlock Holmes and Hercule Poirot, as they both vie to be considered the greatest living criminologist.
Would you like to take a look at this, Inspector?
The electrolysis test for hair construction identification? Not really. I prefer the magnetic analysis myself. It's considerably more accurate.
A thoroughly charming conceit, brought to life expertly by Charles Aidman and Bernard Fox, playing out like Jorge Luis Borges' Death and the Compass, filtered through Neil Simon's Murder by Death. This story had me grinning from ear to ear throughout, these pompous know-it-alls striving to keep one step ahead of each other as they look to solve a mysterious murder due to take place in 3 days.
You know, maybe there is only room for one foremost criminologist in the world.
Its final segment, where a callous executive is put through a series of ordeals by an unexplained force, teaching him not to judge others until you've walked a mile in their shoes, is somewhat weaker, but still an effective enough little morality play, let down by its small scope and a rather cheap conclusion.
Eventually, he died.
The House of the Dead is far from perfect, but it's a terrifically fun little low-budget gem, worth watching for the dueling detective segment alone, a perfect example of how effective this format can be, at giving us eclectic collections of quirky little tales, and why, as a genre, it so often rises above its limitations.
We're supposed to be rivals, aren't we? Oh, incorrigibly so.
1979 Screams of a Winter Night looks like a total washout on paper. A director who never directed another film, former ad exec James L. Wilson. A writer who never wrote again, the wonderfully named Richard H. Wodsack, making an ultra-low-budget PG horror anthology filmed entirely in their home state of Louisiana, and seemingly only released there too, with a cast of actors who either never acted again or went on to be bit part players at best, with the notable exception of a brief first role for Fright Night's William Ragsdale, none of which sounds very promising. Its plot follows a largely unlikable cast of out-of-towners, who ignore the warnings of locals and travel to a cabin in the woods where they regale each other with scary stories. Screams of a Winter Night is not particularly well regarded, or even remembered at all, but it's a nice blend of 70s drive-in backwoods horror with a sprinkle of urban legends and folksy ghost stories. Its lo-fi aesthetic may have been born of necessity, but its loose storytelling and focus on character, with each of the stories springing fairly organically from their teller's philosophies, actually works quite well. It's fairly long, the version I watched being just under 2 hours, although a shorter and tighter version exists, which for some reason excises one of its few short segments, not chunks of the wraparound somewhat bloated tomfoolery, and while I wouldn't especially recommend it, it's not particularly bad either. If it had broken loose of its shackles before its utterly weird ending, and dug harder into the rural gothic horror of the 70s that clearly inspired it, this could well have been a cult classic of sorts. But it's sadly far too tame as it stands, even if it has an undeniable charm and is certainly far better than its pedigree would suggest.
Little Miss Popularity. Have you ever wondered why you're not? Good grief!
As we enter the 1980s, it has become clear that cinematic anthology horror was becoming increasingly tired, in need of a change of style, and that new style emerged in 1982, with George A. Romero and Stephen King's Creepshow. But for now, we'll leave it there, as that is plenty for you ghoulies to munch on. So that's part 1 of the history of horror anthology films. I hope you enjoyed it. If there's an interest in part 2, that will likely take a few months, as this one did, so like and subscribe and all that nice stuff if you want to see more of that kind of content on this channel. If you're wondering why I didn't cover Masaki Kobayashi's 1964 masterpiece Kwaidan, it's too big for this video. There is simply too much to say, as its style, origins and influences are wildly different to the films I'm talking about here, so the plan is for another video covering non-Western anthology horror films if people like this one enough for me to do so. Feel free to comment below anything you want to tell me, good or bad, it's all great, and hopefully I'll see you next time.